The wedding reception was in full swing, a perfect evening that was a mix of elegance and joy. Guests were scattered across the beautifully decorated ballroom, laughing and chatting, their voices blending with the soft melodies of classical music. The bride and groom had just shared their first dance. The way they moved together, so in sync, their faces glowing with happiness, made it clear how much they loved each other. It was the kind of moment that made everyone in the room pause and smile, caught up in the warmth of the occasion. The ballroom itself was breathtaking. Long, white tables were covered in fine linen, each one adorned with tall, flickering candles and stunning flower arrangements. The chandeliers above glittered like stars, casting a soft light that seemed to make the whole room glow. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of drinks and appetizers, offering them to the guests with quiet smiles. Among them was one particular waitress, dressed in black with a simple white apron. She moved through the crowd with grace, her steps light and quick, always paying attention to what needed to be done. She had the quiet efficiency of someone who was used to working in such settings. She wasn't loud, nor was she the type to attract attention. Most guests barely noticed her as she passed by, carrying trays or refilling glasses. But she didn't mind that. She had a job to do, and she did it well. In fact, she preferred staying in the background where she could go unnoticed. The night was young, and everything was going smoothly. The guests were enjoying the delicious food, the elegant ambience, and the smooth music that seemed to float from the grand piano sitting at the side of the room. The piano had been a key part of the wedding. It wasn't the kind of piano where someone would play modern hits or pop songs. This piano was the kind that whispered of something much older, something more refined. It was there to set the mood, to provide an elegant backdrop to the evening, but the piano was hardly being noticed. It sat quietly in the corner, with only a few guests glancing at it from time to time. The real focus of the room was the bride and groom, and for the most part, people were too caught up in the festivities to pay much attention to anything else. There was a man, however, who seemed to take a particular interest in the piano. He was seated at a table near the center of the room, his back straight, his posture almost too perfect. He had an air of confidence about him, the kind that only comes with knowing that you belong in any room you walk into. His suit was well fitted, and his smile was charming, though it seemed a bit forced. He looked like someone who had practiced the art of being charming in social settings, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. As the evening wore on and the drinks flowed, he began to feel more at ease, his confidence growing with each passing moment. The conversation at his table shifted from the usual wedding small talk to something more playful, a bit more daring. He seemed to enjoy being the center of attention, and as his tipsiness began to show, he started to look around the room for something to amuse himself with. That's when his gaze landed on the piano. A mischievous smile spread across his face, and he leaned over to the people sitting nearby. "You know," he said, his voice a little louder than usual, "I bet that waitress could play the piano. Look at her. She's got that look about her, don't you think?" The group of guests around him chuckled, intrigued by his sudden shift in focus. They didn't seem to mind his teasing, seeing it as nothing more than a harmless joke. The man leaned back in his chair and glanced over at the waitress, who was passing by their table, effortlessly balancing a tray of drinks in her hands. "Hey," he called out, his voice carrying across the room, a little too loudly for the setting. "You play the piano, don't you?" The waitress didn't immediately stop. She glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable, before continuing on her way. It was clear she hadn't heard him, or perhaps she was pretending not to. But the man wasn't one to give up so easily. "You know, you could give us a little performance," he said, louder this time. "A tune or two. Come on, I'm sure you're better than the professionals they've hired." "You look like you've got talent." The guests around him, sensing an opportunity for some fun, started to laugh. Some of them even clapped in mock encouragement. It was all in good humor, they thought. Just a bit of playful teasing to add some lightheartedness to the evening. But the waitress, still holding her tray, didn't respond. She simply moved to the next table, keeping her head down and her focus on her work. The man wasn't done yet. He leaned back in his chair, enjoying the attention he was getting. "Come on," he called again. "Don't be shy. Play us a song." The laughter from his table grew louder, and soon others in the room started to notice. Some were curious about what was happening, while others simply wanted to see what would unfold. The piano, which had been quietly sitting in the corner for most of the evening, now seemed to be at the center of attention. The guests, many of them slightly tipsy, were growing more and more eager to see if the waitress would take the bait, but the woman didn't react. She wasn't one to make a scene, and she wasn't about to start now. She continued her work, her movements steady and focused. However, the teasing didn't stop. It kept going, growing a little louder and more insistent. "Come on," someone shouted. "Play something for us." At this point, it was impossible for her not to hear. The energy in the room was shifting. The laughter had turned into something more like a challenge, and the man who had started it all was grinning from ear to ear, convinced that he had successfully put the waitress in an awkward spot. She paused for a moment, just enough to make the guests wonder what she was going to do. The laughter died down, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Finally, she gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, as if agreeing to something that she didn't really want to do. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to make the room fall into silence. The man who had started the teasing smiled, clearly thinking he had won. He raised his glass as if to toast her decision. "That's the spirit," he said. The waitress turned and walked toward the piano, her steps measured, but with a certain grace that made it clear she wasn't just going through the motions. There was something deliberate about the way she moved. She didn't say a word, but her actions spoke volumes. The crowd watched as she reached the piano. She hesitated for a split second, as if weighing her options. She sat down on the bench with the same calm composure she had shown all evening. And then, without another glance toward the crowd, she placed her fingers on the keys. The guests exchanged looks, unsure of what to expect. Some had been expecting a half-hearted attempt at a tune. Others were just curious to see what would happen next. But no one in the room was prepared for what came next. The room was filled with a strange kind of anticipation as the waitress sat at the piano. The guests, who had been laughing and chatting only moments before, had fallen into a quiet, almost respectful silence. No one seemed to know what to expect next, but everyone knew that something was about to happen. The piano, which had been nothing more than a decorative piece until now, had suddenly become the focus of all eyes. The woman's calm, measured movements only added to the tension in the air. For a moment, she just sat there, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. It was as though she was taking a deep breath, preparing herself for something. The quiet in the room felt almost heavy. The man who had been teasing her earlier sat back in his chair, looking smug, as if he had already won. But there was something different in the air now. His earlier confidence was starting to fade, replaced by curiosity and maybe even a hint of embarrassment. He hadn't expected her to actually sit down and play. He had assumed she would brush off his challenge, as most people would. But now, as she adjusted herself on the piano bench and her fingers hovered above the keys, it was clear that this was no ordinary waitress. The guests had all stopped talking. Even the sound of clinking glasses had faded into the background. The only noise in the room was the soft hum of the air conditioning, which now seemed louder than ever. The piano, sitting in the corner of the room, felt like it was waiting for the right moment to come to life. The woman didn't rush. She was taking her time. Her hands were poised with such confidence that it was almost as though she had been here before. She looked like someone who had spent countless hours in front of a piano, someone who wasn't afraid of being watched. The man who had teased her earlier took a long sip of his drink, his expression unreadable. He didn't expect the woman to play like this. In fact, part of him was still half expecting her to stand up and walk away. But when she started to play, even the most skeptical people in the room could see that this was not just some random waitress playing a few notes. This was someone who knew what they were doing. The first few notes were slow and gentle, as though she was testing the piano, getting a feel for it. The music wasn't loud or showy. It was soft, almost intimate. It wasn't the kind of piece that would immediately grab your attention, but it drew you in nonetheless. There was a quiet elegance in the way her fingers moved over the keys, and before long, the music began to fill the room, weaving a story without words. The guests, still in shock, started to shift in their seats. Some leaned forward, trying to catch every note. Others exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. The laughter from earlier had completely disappeared, replaced by a deep sense of curiosity. No one spoke, no one moved. It was as though they were all waiting for something that would make this moment unforgettable. And then it happened. As the woman continued to play, the room seemed to change. The music was no longer just a background noise. It was part of the moment. It made the space feel different, more alive. The people who had been talking and laughing just minutes before were now completely absorbed in the music. It was almost as if the piano had a magic all its own. The notes filled the room with a sense of calm, but there was something powerful about it too. It wasn't just beautiful music, it was a moment of connection, a moment that made everyone stop and listen. The man who had challenged her was now staring at her in disbelief. He had been expecting something simple, something small, but what he got instead was something far greater. He could feel the weight of the moment as the music swept over him. It wasn't just the sound of the piano, it was the way she played it, the way her fingers moved so effortlessly over the keys. It was as if she wasn't just playing the piano, but speaking through it, telling a story that everyone in the room could hear, even if they didn't quite understand it. For a few seconds, the man's smug expression faded away. He was no longer the one in control of the situation. He was just another person in the room, caught up in the beauty of the music. And that was when he realized he had underestimated her. He had thought she was just a waitress, a simple woman going about her job. But now, as he watched her play, he saw that there was much more to her than he had ever imagined. The music swelled, rising and falling in waves, each note like a breath. The woman's hands moved with a kind of fluidity that seemed almost effortless. It was clear now that this was no impromptu performance. This was something she had done many times before. Her fingers danced across the keys, and the sound that came from the piano was full of emotion. It wasn't just technical skill. It was passion. It was depth. It was life. The guests could feel it in the air, and they were all transfixed. Somewhere in the room, someone started to wipe away a tear. It was a subtle movement, but it didn't go unnoticed. Others in the room seemed to hold their breath, their eyes wide as they watched her, as if they were afraid that if they blinked, they might miss something important. No one had expected this. No one had expected the quiet, unassuming woman to be capable of something so breathtaking. But here she was, playing a song that spoke to the soul. As the final notes of the piece drifted into silence, the room remained still. It was as if time itself had paused for those few moments. The woman sat still, her hands resting gently on the keys, her expression calm and serene, as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. But in truth, everything had changed. The crowd, still in shock, began to stir, exchanging glances with one another. And then, like a wave, the applause started. It was slow at first, almost hesitant, as if the guests weren't sure if they should clap or simply remain silent in awe. But as the seconds passed, the applause grew louder, more confident, until the entire room was on its feet, clapping and cheering for the woman who had just stunned them all. The man who had been teasing her earlier was now standing too, clapping harder than anyone else. His face was red, a mix of embarrassment and admiration. He had no idea what to say. How could he possibly respond to something like this? How could he go back to acting as if nothing had happened? He was the one who had started all this, the one who had thought it would be funny to challenge her. But now, as he looked at her, he realized that he had completely misjudged her. What had started as a playful comment had turned into something far more meaningful. The woman, for her part, simply nodded politely as the applause washed over her. She didn't seek attention or praise. She wasn't the type to make a big deal out of it. She had done what she came to do. She had played her piece, and now she would move on. But as she stood up from the piano bench and began to walk back toward her duties, the room seemed to hum with a new energy. The guests were still, whispering to one another, their faces bright with excitement and wonder. No one would forget what had just happened. The wedding had been beautiful, yes, but it was this moment, this unexpected performance, that would stay with them long after the night was over. The room buzzed with a quiet energy after the performance. People had settled back into their seats, though the atmosphere had changed. It was no longer just a wedding reception. It had transformed into something much more profound, something that no one in the room would ever forget. The music lingered in the air, like an echo that wouldn't fade. For a few moments, no one knew what to do next. The guests glanced at one another, unsure of whether they should continue their conversations or just sit there, still processing what had just happened. The man who had started the teasing was the first to break the silence. He was still standing, still clapping, though his hands had begun to slow down. He was smiling, but there was a slight awkwardness in his smile now. He had meant to tease her, to put her on the spot, but instead she had turned the tables entirely. And now all he could do was stand there, caught in the glow of her unexpected talent, that it wasn't lost on him that everyone in the room had witnessed his teasing. They had all seen him challenge her, heard his jokes and playful jabs. And now they were watching him, waiting for his reaction. He could feel their eyes on him, and for a moment he didn't know what to say. He had underestimated her. But how could he admit that? How could he go back to being the confident, witty man who had challenged a random waitress, only to be completely blown away by her performance? He finally sat back down, though he didn't feel quite as comfortable as he had earlier. He had thought he was in control of the situation, but now it felt like he was the one who had been caught off guard. There was no easy way to undo what had just happened, no way to erase the moment. And that, in a way, was what made it so powerful. He couldn't take it back, and neither could anyone else in the room. As the applause gradually died down, the guests began to murmur among themselves. Some were still talking about the performance, their voices filled with admiration. Others were trying to process the unexpected twist in the evening's events. No one had expected the quiet waitress to be so talented, and it made everyone look at her in a new light. The power of the moment wasn't just about the music itself, but the way it had turned everything upside down. The woman, who had been a mere servant in their eyes just moments before, was now the one everyone was talking about. It was as if the piano had lifted her to another level, making her not just part of the event, but the heart of it. She moved back into the crowd, her posture still composed, as though nothing had happened. She picked up her tray again, refilling drinks and delivering food to the tables, her movements steady and graceful. But there was a subtle shift in the way people looked at her now. They no longer saw her as just a waitress. They saw her as someone who had a depth and a story that they couldn't even begin to understand. The man who had teased her earlier watched her for a moment, still caught in the aftermath of her performance. He was no longer the center of attention. The room had shifted its focus, and now it was all on her. Some guests whispered to each other, their faces still glowing with the excitement of what had just happened. "Did you hear that?" one woman asked her friend. "I had no idea she could play like that. It was like the piano was part of her." The friend nodded, her eyes wide. "I've never heard anything like that before." It was like she was telling a story with every note. Incredible. The man who had teased her leaned in toward the table where a few of his friends were sitting. He couldn't help but feel embarrassed. "I had no idea," he admitted quietly, his voice a little sheepish. I thought she was just some waitress, but she's amazing." His friends nodded, still in awe of the performance, but one of them couldn't help but ask, "So, what do you think now? Were you wrong to tease her?" The man thought about it for a moment, feeling the weight of the question. He wasn't sure how to answer. Of course, he had been wrong to tease her. It was clear now that she wasn't just anyone, that she had something special. But how could he admit that? How could he apologize for making her the subject of his joke, something that had turned into a much bigger moment than he had ever intended? Meanwhile, the woman continued her work, seemingly unaffected by the whirlwind of attention she had just caused. She didn't seem to need anyone's approval, and that was part of what made her so intriguing. She wasn't performing for anyone. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She had simply done what she had always done, played the piano. And in doing so, she had shown the guests something they had never expected. As the night wore on, the music had slowly faded into the background. The wedding had resumed its usual pace, with guests eating, drinking, and talking. But even as the focus returned to the bride and groom, there was a lingering feeling in the room, a sense that something special had taken place. People were still talking about the performance, even though the music had long stopped. It was a topic of conversation that everyone kept returning to, as though the mere mention of it was enough to rekindle the sense of awe had filled the room moments before. The man who had challenged the woman earlier was still thinking about the performance. He found himself watching her as she moved through the crowd, her composure unchanged, her focus solely on doing her job. But now, when he looked at her, he didn't see a waitress. He saw someone far more complex, far more interesting. He wondered what her life was like outside of this wedding, outside of the role she played that night. What had led her to this moment? How had she come to be so talented, so unassuming? He felt a strange urge to go up to her, to apologize for his earlier behavior, but he wasn't sure how to approach her. What would he say? How could he make up for his earlier teasing, now that he understood just how wrong he had been? He realized that, in that moment, he wasn't sure he could fix what he had done. He had underestimated her, and now it was too late to take it back. The woman continued to move through the crowd, her tray now empty, her tasks nearly finished. She had no idea what the others were saying about her. She had no need to know. She had simply done what she was called to do, play the piano, and then return to her duties. For her, that was enough. The evening was just another night of work, just another event to get through. She didn't need anyone's admiration or approval. She had her music, and that was all that mattered. But for everyone else in the room, the evening had been changed forever. They would talk about the performance for weeks, months, maybe even years to come. They would remember the quiet waitress who had stepped up to the piano and played as though her life depended on it. And they would remember the man who had teased her, only to realize that he had been the one who was truly out of place. As the night continued and the guests slowly made their way toward the exit, no one forgot the moment that had defined the evening. The wedding had been beautiful, but it was the unexpected performance that had stolen the show. And no one would ever see the waitress the same way again. The night was winding down, and the guests were starting to gather their things, preparing to head home. The music had shifted from the classical pieces that had been playing earlier to something lighter, a more upbeat track that felt appropriate for the final moments of the evening. The air had a soft chill now, the kind that comes when the sun has dipped low and the buzz of the evening begins to settle into a gentle calm. The bride and groom were surrounded by friends and family, exchanging hugs and well wishes. But there was one person who seemed to remain untouched by the festivities, the woman who had played the piano. She moved quietly through the crowd, her tray now empty, her work done for the night. She had done what she was asked, and yet the evening had changed for everyone else. It had changed for her too, but she didn't know exactly how. She had felt the moment, the hush in the room as she played, the way the music had swept over the guests and brought them together in something unexpected. She didn't know why the piano had called to her the way it did, but she had answered its call, just as she always did when she found herself at the keys. But now, as the last of the guests slowly made their way toward the door, the woman felt a familiar sense of distance, of being an observer rather than a participant. The music was gone now, and so was the magic it had brought. The guests were no longer talking about her. They were caught up in the excitement of the newlyweds, the last few moments of celebration. The woman felt like she had already slipped back into the background. It wasn't that she minded. Exactly. She had never craved the spotlight. She had always been content to stay in the shadows, to do the work that needed to be done without fanfare or recognition. The piano for her had always been a personal escape, a way to express things that words couldn't capture. But tonight, for just a brief moment, the music had connected her to something greater. It had made her feel seen in a way that she wasn't used to. It had made her feel like maybe she mattered, not just as someone doing a job, but as a person with something meaningful to offer. Still, as the night wound to a close, she returned to her duties, refilling glasses and clearing empty plates. The guests who remained were mostly the ones who had been part of the wedding party, close friends and family who lingered to share a few final moments before they said their goodbyes. A few of them nodded at her as she passed, but there was no longer the same sense of wonder in their eyes. They had seen the performance, and now they were moving on, caught up in the next moment. She glanced over at the man who had teased her earlier. He was standing near the door now, talking to a few people, his back straight and his shoulders squared. He was still wearing the same smile, though it seemed a little more forced now, a little less confident. She couldn't help but notice that. He was glancing in her direction from time to time, as if unsure of what to do next. She didn't blame him. She wasn't sure what he was thinking either. But what struck her most was the realization that he wasn't just one of the guests. He had been the one to challenge her, to test her, and now he seemed almost out of place in his own surroundings. It was strange to think that the same man who had dared her to play was now the one who looked unsettled, unsure of himself. She didn't know what had made him act the way he did earlier. Maybe he was just looking for attention, or maybe he didn't understand the power of what he was asking. Either way, she knew he had no idea what it felt like to sit at the piano and play, to let the music take over, to feel the weight of the keys beneath your fingers and the vibrations of the strings echoing through your chest. It was a feeling that couldn't be described with words. It was something you had to experience for yourself. The night was almost over, and the last few People were gathering their coats, exchanging final words with the bride and groom. As the woman made her way toward the kitchen to return her tray, she was stopped by one of the guests, a woman who had been seated near the piano earlier. The woman had watched the performance with wide eyes, her expression filled with awe. She smiled at the waitress now, her eyes still bright with admiration. "Excuse me," she said, her voice warm but a little hesitant. "I just wanted to say that." That was incredible. I've never heard anything like that before. She paused, her eyes searching for the right words. "You're really talented." The woman nodded, giving a small, polite smile. "Thank you," she replied softly. "I just play." The guest shook her head. "No, really. That was something special. You should be performing somewhere, not serving drinks at weddings." The woman didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure how to. The idea of performing, of being the center of attention, felt foreign to her. It was one thing to sit at the piano in a quiet room, just her and the music. But performing in front of people, expecting them to clap and praise her, that was something she had never considered. She had never wanted to be a star, to be in the spotlight. She had always just wanted to play. "I don't know about all that," she said, her voice quiet. "I'm just here to do my job." The woman's expression softened, and she gave the waitress a gentle smile. "Well, you're very good at it, and I'm sure people would love to hear more from you. Maybe you should think about it. Don't sell yourself short." The woman was taken aback by the comment. It wasn't something she had ever thought about before. She had never considered performing for others, never thought that anyone would want to hear her play. She wasn't even sure if she was ready for something like that. The idea of stepping out from the background, of putting herself forward in such a public way, felt intimidating. But at the same time, the compliment made her pause. Maybe she was more than she had allowed herself to believe. She smiled again, more genuinely this time, and nodded. "Thank you," she said. "I'll think about it." As the woman walked away, the waitress couldn't help but feel a strange flutter in her chest. She wasn't used to compliments like that, wasn't used to people seeing her for something more than what she appeared to be. She wasn't sure if it meant anything, if it would change anything for her. But it was nice, in a way, to hear someone say that she mattered, that what she did was special. She had always played for herself, never thinking about what others might think. But now, for the first time, she wondered if she had something worth sharing with the world. In the quiet that followed, the last of the guests slowly trickled out, their voices fading as they passed through the door. The wedding was officially over. The bride and groom were gone, heading off to their honeymoon, and the staff began to clean up the remains of the evening, the leftover food, the half-empty glasses, the tablecloths that would soon be folded and packed away. It was a familiar routine, one that the woman had done many times before, but tonight there was something different about it. The piano, the performance, the way the guests had reacted, all of it felt like a turning point. She wasn't sure what it meant yet, but she felt that something had shifted. Even if she couldn't name it. As she gathered her things, she couldn't help but glance over at the empty piano. It sat there quietly, its keys still and waiting. She had already walked away from it once, but somehow it felt like she was being pulled back, drawn to it by something she couldn't explain. Maybe she would come back tomorrow, maybe the next day or the next. But one thing was certain. The music wasn't finished with her. Yet, a few days after the wedding, life returned to its usual rhythm. The woman continued with her routine, working long hours at various events, catering to guests, delivering food, and making sure everything ran smoothly. But in the quiet moments, when her hands were empty or her mind wandered, she found herself thinking about the piano. The music had stayed with her, lingering in her mind like a melody she couldn't shake off. It wasn't just the performance itself, but the way the room had reacted, the way the notes had seemed to connect everyone. It had been a powerful moment, and in some ways, it felt like it was calling her back, urging her to listen. She had tried to ignore it at first. After all, she was just a waitress. She wasn't someone who played music for crowds. That was a world she hadn't been a part of for a long time. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on other things, on the work she was doing, the tasks she was completing, she couldn't push the thought of playing out of her mind. She had done it before, back when she was younger, but life had taken her in different directions, and the piano had become a distant memory. One afternoon, as she was wiping down a table after an event, she heard a familiar sound. It was faint at first, just a soft melody drifting from a distance, but it was enough to stop her in her tracks. She knew that sound. It was the same piano, the same chords she had played at the wedding, only now it was playing without her fingers. The sound seemed to call her, pulling her toward it. Furious, she followed the music down a long hallway that led to a small lounge area where the piano had been placed. As she rounded the corner, she saw someone sitting at the keys, playing a soft, familiar tune. For a moment, she stood there, watching in silence. The person playing wasn't anyone she recognized, but the music they were producing was beautiful. It was calm, but there was an undercurrent of something more, a depth, an emotion that seemed to be hiding just beneath the surface of each note. She stood there for a while, just listening, until the music came to a quiet end. The person at the piano stood up, turned toward her, and smiled. "I didn't realize I had an audience," they said, their voice light and friendly. The woman smiled back, though she didn't know quite what to say. "That was beautiful," she said simply. "Thanks," the person replied, still smiling. "I'm glad you liked it." For a moment, there was an awkward silence. The woman wasn't sure what to do next. She didn't play piano anymore, not like that, not in front of others. She had forgotten how it felt to sit at the keys and let the music take over. But something about the way the person had played had stirred something inside her, something she hadn't realized was still there. "Play?" the person asked, as if sensing her hesitation. The woman nodded, though it felt strange to admit it. "A long time ago," she said quietly, "I used to play, but it's been a while." "You should play again," the person said, their voice kind and encouraging. "It's amazing what music can do, how it can change a room, change how people feel." The woman hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that. She wasn't sure if she was ready to open that part of herself up again. But something about the way the person spoke made her think twice. It was as if the music, even in its quiet absence, had been waiting for her to return. "I don't know," she said softly. "I'm not sure if I could. It's been so long. And it's not like I perform for people." The person at the piano shrugged. "That's not what it's about, is it? It's about the music, about what it makes you feel. Maybe you don't need to perform. Maybe you just need to play for yourself." The words hit her harder than she expected. Maybe she had been so focused on the idea of performing, of playing for others, that she had forgotten why she had started playing in the first place. It wasn't about impressing anyone or being seen. It was about the music itself, about the way it made her feel alive, connected to something beyond the everyday. "I think I've forgotten that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Person smiled again, as if they understood exactly what she meant. "You don't have to remember all at once. Just start with a note, a chord, something simple. Sometimes that's all it takes." The woman nodded slowly. She wasn't sure if she was ready to dive back in, but the idea of it didn't seem as impossible as it had before. Maybe, just maybe, she could start again. Maybe she could find her way back to the music without worrying about what anyone else thought, A few days later, after another event, the woman found herself standing in front of the piano once more. The room was empty, the lights dim, and there was a strange calm in the air. She sat down slowly, her fingers hovering over the keys. For a moment, she felt a strange sense of fear, a hesitation that almost made her stand up and walk away. What if she wasn't as good as she remembered? What if the music wasn't there anymore? But then she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and pressed her fingers down on the keys. The first note was shaky, unsure, but it filled the room with sound. And in that moment, it was like everything else fell away. The worry, the self-doubt, the fear, it all melted into the music. She played another note, and then another, until she was lost in the rhythm of the piece, her fingers moving as if they knew exactly where to go. The music flowed through her, each note taking on a life of its own, telling a story she hadn't known she needed to tell. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. She wasn't thinking about anything except the music, the way it sounded, the way it made her feel. It was just her and the piano, and in that moment, that was all that mattered. She played for what felt like hours, until her fingers began to ache and the music slowly faded into a quiet end. She sat there for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the keys, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in ages. It was as if a part of her that had been dormant for so long had woken up again. When she finally stood up, she felt different. She didn't know exactly how or why, but she felt like she had rediscovered something important. The music wasn't just a way to fill the silence. It was a part of who she was. And maybe, just maybe, she could share it with the world. Not because she needed to perform or prove anything, but because it was something she loved, something that had always been a part of her. As she walked away from the piano, her heart felt lighter, her step more certain. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Maybe she would play again soon. Maybe she wouldn't. But whatever happened, she knew one thing for sure. The music was a part of her, and it always would be. Weeks passed, and life continued to move forward as it always did. The woman, though, had changed in subtle ways. She still worked at events, still did the same things, but something within her had shifted. The piano no longer sat as an empty symbol of something lost or forgotten. It had become a bridge, a way to reconnect with a part of herself that she had long ignored. She wasn't performing in front of crowds or seeking any sort of recognition, but in the quiet moments when she sat at the piano, she felt more herself than she had in years. Every so often, the thought of playing for others would cross her mind, but it was always followed by doubt. What if she couldn't live up to what people expected? What if she didn't play well enough? But then she would remind herself that it wasn't about that. It was about the music, about the feeling that came with it, the peace, the release. As long as she remembered that, she could keep playing. Whether anyone else ever heard or not, it was a warm Saturday afternoon when the phone rang. She was in the middle of putting together a tray of appetizers for a small gathering when she heard the familiar buzz. She picked up the phone, wiping her hands on a towel before answering. Hello? Hi, is this the woman who played piano at the wedding last month? The woman paused, surprised. She wasn't used to people calling her like this, especially about something so specific. Yes, that was me. How can I help you? This is going to sound a bit strange, the voice on the other end said, but I was at the wedding you played at, and I just wanted to say that your performance was amazing. It really stood out to me. Actually, I was wondering if you'd be interested in playing for a small event I'm planning. Nothing big, just a casual gathering of a few people. I think your music would be a perfect fit. The woman was silent for a moment, unsure how to respond. She had been expecting the conversation to end after the polite compliments, But this was different. She was being asked to perform something she hadn't done in years. It was a small event, nothing too formal, but the idea of playing for others again stirred both excitement and nervousness in her. "I don't usually perform," she said, her voice hesitant. "I just play for myself mostly. I'm not sure if I'd be the right fit for something like that." The person on the other end of the line didn't seem deterred by her reluctance. "I understand if you're nervous," they said warmly. "But honestly, I think the music you played at that wedding had such an impact on people. It wasn't about the show. It was just real. That's exactly what I'm looking for. If you're willing, I'd love to have you. You'd be perfect." The woman's mind raced. She didn't want to back out, but she wasn't sure if she was ready. Performing for an audience, no matter how small, was something she hadn't done in so long. She had always been content to play in private, with no pressure. But something about this call felt different. Maybe it was the way the person spoke, or maybe it was the fact that someone had seen something in her music that she had almost forgotten. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "I'll do it," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'll play." A surge of nerves hit her immediately after she hung up the phone. What had she just agreed to? The thought of being in front of people again, playing her music for others. To hear made her stomach twist with anxiety. But there was also a spark of excitement, a flicker of possibility. For so long, she had held herself back, convinced that playing for others wasn't something she was capable of, or that it wasn't something she wanted. But now, she wasn't so sure. She had always loved the music. Maybe, just maybe, it was. Time to see if others would love it too. For the next few days, the woman practiced. She didn't rush through her playing like she used each note. Each chord was something she thought about. She wanted to play from the heart, not just from memory. The music felt different when she played with intention. It wasn't about impressing anyone or trying to sound perfect. It was about connecting with the music again, letting it tell its story. The event arrived, and the woman was filled with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. She arrived early to the venue, a small but cozy space with warm lighting and soft furniture. It felt intimate, nothing like the large, formal events she had been a part of before. The host greeted her and showed her to the piano, which sat in the corner of the room. "It's a small crowd, just a few close friends," the host assured her. "Nothing too formal, just a chance to enjoy the music." The woman nodded, though her nerves didn't completely settle. She had seen the room fill up with people, all chatting and laughing, and she couldn't help but wonder if they were expecting something grand, something polished. But when the time came, she sat down at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys. The room fell silent as soon as she began to play. There was no applause, no build-up, just the soft, steady sound of the music filling the space dotted first. She felt out of place, as if she was still unsure of herself. But as the first few notes flowed from her fingers, the tension started to fade. She wasn't performing for the crowd. She realized she was playing for the moment, for herself and for the music. She let the sound surround her, let it wash over her with each chord. It was as though she had stepped into a different world, a world where the worries of being perfect or impressing others didn't exist. The only thing that mattered was the music dot as she played. She could feel the atmosphere shift. The guests, who had been talking and laughing before, grew quiet. Some of them closed their eyes, letting the sound of the piano take over. Others watched with rapt attention, captivated by the feeling in the music. The woman's fingers moved effortlessly over the keys, lost in the rhythm, no longer thinking about the people around her. It was as if the music itself was speaking, telling its own story without needing words. For the first time in a long time, she felt completely in sync with the moment, with the music, and with the world around her. The anxiety had melted away, replaced by a sense of calm and connection. She wasn't playing to impress or to win approval. She was simply playing because it was what she loved to do. When the last note faded and the room was still, a woman looked up, unsure of what to expect. The guests were silent for a moment, as if they were processing the music they had just heard. Then slowly, one by one, they began to clap. At first, it was soft, hesitant, but then it grew louder, more enthusiastic. The woman felt a warmth in her chest, a rush of emotions she hadn't expected. She wasn't sure if it was the applause that had moved her, or the realization that she had done something she once thought was impossible. But whatever it was, it felt like a quiet victory. After the performance, the host came up to her with a smile. "That was incredible," they said. "I knew you'd be perfect for this." The woman smiled, a little surprised at how much the experience had meant to her. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't expect it to feel like that." And in that moment, she realized something. She didn't need to perform in front of large crowds or be celebrated for her music. She didn't need to be famous or praised. All she needed was the music itself and the understanding that it was a part of her, a gift she could share, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She had found a way back to her passion, and that was enough. As the night went on, the guests continued to talk and laugh, and the woman remained in the background, quietly reflecting on the experience. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to embrace whatever came next. She had rediscovered something important within herself, and no matter where life took her, she knew that the music would always be there, waiting for her to come back whenever she needed it.